Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sensemaker Live Thinking with Tortoise in partnership with Santander. We do this in partnership with them and we're grateful to them for their support. I am Giles Whittell, I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I'm very concerned about our topic today because I think, like a lot of people, I'm just wondering if I'm ever going to go on holiday again. Our subject is Britain's borders. What took us so long to close them? And I hope that over the course of the next hour, we will get to why suddenly they feel so impermeable. Is it a smart strategy? If it is, why did it take so long? How long will it last? Will we ever go on holiday again? And importantly, who suffers from this policy? There is a whole there's a nation of travelers to consider, and there's the travel industry to consider as well. So, as I was saying to our guests before we started, in a sense, we've got two separate conversations, one epidemiological / demographic, and the other about business and logistics. But there's a real sense, I think, in which they come together in the hotels where, as of Monday, incoming travelers from 33 countries are supposed to quarantine at their own expense if they can get a room. The booking site crashed yesterday, I think, and I don't think it's up again yet, but I'm sure we'll find out in a second. Anyway, I'm delighted that we've got two very knowledgeable people to help us with each side of this. We've got Professor Andy Tatem, who's an expert in spatial demography and epidemiology from the University of Southampton. Hello, Andy. And he, I hope, is going to explain, among other things, to us a project called World Pop, which brings together enormous quantities of data. And also we have with us Jennifer Morris, the news editor of the Travel Trade Gazette, the industry, the trade paper for the industry that gets everybody moving. And we'll get on to that. I took a screenshot of your homepage just now. It's fairly alarming. As I nodded off, by the way, last night, I thought maybe tomorrow at the Thinking, I should invite people to contribute their favorite TV viewing in the chat if we are going to be in lockdown for a long time. Those last thing at night thoughts are very often crazy, but I thought it again when I woke up this morning. So if by the end of the hour we're all feeling very gloomy and that we aren't going to get anywhere soon, maybe we'll have collected some viewing recommendations in the chat. Which reminds me, the point of the Thinking is for everybody to pitch in with your views. As you know, if you've been to a Thinking before, you can do that in the chat. We might come to you. My colleague Phoebe is keeping a close eye on the chat, and I will try to as well. You can also raise your electronic hand, and then we will see you. And I've got this. Yes, that. I'm just trying to move my chat across my screen, but because I'm blocking myself out. There we go. There we go. You're getting there, Giles. All right. To business. I want to come first to Andy Tatem. And the policy which comes into force on Monday of mandatory quarantining for incoming travelers from 33 countries. I think we have this right, that there is a complete ban on movement of nationals of those countries. But if you are a UK or an Irish national coming home, you have to quarantine for 10 days. You have to get tested at 2 days and 8 days. Now, can you start by telling us a bit about the data that you marshal and what that tells us about how people are moving around in the pandemic? And then forgive me for asking a third question on top of that. Can that tell us whether this policy is working?
Sure. So I direct a group where we have been focused for many years on trying to understand how people and diseases are moving around countries and around the planet. And over the past past decade, that's really developed from the basic use of kind of travel history surveys or census data to ask where people lived a year ago, to now the use of aggregate data from mobile phones. So everybody's carrying smartphones nowadays, and that gives us amazing data. Air traffic statistics are there as well in terms of passenger numbers. And whenever we look at these kinds of data, it's really amazing how much people do move within countries and between countries. And the real advance over the past few years that we work with collaborators on is genetic data. So now we can not only make estimates of how people are moving and try and think about how that relates to disease, now we can actually look at those genetics of those samples and see, oh, this actually happened. And some of the most powerful analyses that have come out recently have been about the importation of COVID into the UK in the first lockdown and over summer, in terms of huge numbers of cases, independent introductions, very strong evidence that those happened, and pointing towards how we might think about policies. So,
can I just ask a bit more about that data, the genetic data? Is that derived from mass testing? And if so, is it the PCR as opposed to the lateral flow? And obviously it's separate from anything you're getting from mobile phones, but is it almost real time in the same way?
It's not almost real time, and it's the kind of PCR type analysis, and it's something that the UK leads the world on in terms of sequencing case data, far more than any country in the world, and probably one of the reasons why this new variant was identified here. It may not have originated here, but it's one of the reasons why we've been able to identify it. The kind of mobile phone type data is near real time, say, and I think that it's as a complementary analysis of bringing those two data sets together. So the genetic analysis, it's only samples, you need to have strong capacity, there needs to be efforts to collect that data. The mobile data doesn't tell you about how the pathogen is moving, but tells you much more real-time information on large numbers of people and how they are moving around and how those connections between countries are changing.
Okay, and just staying with the PCR data for a moment. As I understand it, everything that you use is public domain, is that right? Or have you had to get special permission to get access to this data at Southampton?
So it's really, for us, we're not working directly with the genetic data. I think this is something that's come out, there's been really strong and across, since the first outbreaks in China, it's been in big international collaborations. So there are groups who are specialized in looking at this genetic data. There are groups like ours who look more at flight data, on geographic data, on who's at risk most, and the mobile phone data. And bringing those all together is where the strength and the insights come. So we have to be very careful and sensitive about some of the mobile phone data, for sure. Right. Whereas other groups have careful collaborations around the genetic data. But more and more of this is becoming open with careful guards put on these kinds of data in terms of making sure individuals can't be identified and that there are sensitivities that are addressed.
Right. But just to be clear, so you're not accessing the genome analysis data directly, you're using sort of meta surveys that others are doing, and forgive me for using the word, but you're scraping that, are you?
We're collaborating with groups who are part of these genetics consortiums. Okay. So there's a huge consortium in the UK where the government invested 20 million to set up this testing and analysis. At the very start of the outbreak, one of the first things that was amazingly rapidly done was sequencing the genome of of the coronavirus, the new form. And that was put openly on the web. And so this kind of open collaboration that's enabling international teams to work with the same data and rapidly do those analysis has been one of the positives out of a lot of negativity, for sure.
Coming to the point you made about the UK possibly not being the place where the Kentish variant originated, do you have a gut sense of where else it might have originated?
That's a great question, and I think there's more and more being found out about this pandemic as we go along. Certainly, there are countries that have not put in place strong surveillance all the way through. There are countries that have increased their surveillance and then reduced it. There are countries that share data openly. There are countries that don't, and this is part of the struggle in terms of, for instance, this selection of red list countries. It's hard to know if that's the right selection, if there are other countries that aren't doing strong surveillance and aren't reporting variants or case numbers. So all the way along, I think we're having to make the most of the best data that's out there and using modeling to fill gaps, bringing in different data sets to try and make the best estimates we can under time pressure. And as time goes on, I'm sure in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we will have a really good picture on possibly where the pandemic started, possibly where all these variants originated. But at the moment,
okay, in 5 or 10 years' time. But in the meantime, just coming back to the red list, we want to know if the list is a good idea, and if so, whether the right countries are on it. Is the data that you're analyzing, does it give you a sense of that?
It does give a partial sense in that we can look at data on where variants of concern have been found, and then what are the major travel routes out of those locations. And so some of the countries on this red list make sense. But there are also, for instance, out of Brazil, one of the biggest travel routes is to the USA. And then there's a huge travel route from the USA to the UK. So
direct, not via Portugal.
Not via Portugal, no. I mean, going to the USA and then coming over, there are lots of these indirect routes, which I think are problematic because there are countries that are not doing strong surveillance and may already have these variants. So it's a balance to be struck between keeping our country open and economies going, just like we've had with lockdowns.
Right.
And it's a similar situation, I think, to the tiered system in lockdowns we had in the UK. We know that there was still lots of movement going on across the UK, and that's perhaps why the tiered system didn't really work very well. It just slowed things down. And this is a similar situation. It's a kind of tiered system of countries. I think we'll still see these worrying variants come into the country. And it's then about how strong is our surveillance to pick those up.
Right. Two questions, and I'm going to come to Jennifer in a second, but it's one of those things where the questions cascade. Are there any other important indirect routes into this country, or for that matter, into other countries that might be vulnerable to big new outbreaks, apart from the one you've just mentioned, Brazil, US, UK? I mean, an indirect route from South Africa, for example.
I think we're in an incredibly interconnected world at the moment, and certainly by targeting the highest traffic routes, you can slow down potentially that importation. But it's a tricky one to stop completely. And what we saw in the very start of this pandemic was countries closing their border to China, but actually looking at the genetic data again of what actually then happened was pretty much very few of the small outbreaks that occurred of the thousands of introductions. obviously a handful were from China directly, but a huge number were from Italy, Spain, and France. And so we were, I guess, continually a bit behind the curve in that there was spread from China to other countries, there was spread into Italy, into Iran, and major outbreaks there. And that then seeded outbreaks elsewhere. And there's a lot of evidence as well. The US major outbreaks started and came from Europe as well. So there's a lot of talk about closing borders to China. You heard from President Trump many times, the success, but actually the genetic evidence points towards everybody acting a bit too late on some of these things.
Were you able to tell from the data that you were looking at whether were you able to trace them? For example, the UK outbreaks seeded from Italy, Spain, and France. Were you able to trace them back? And if so, did they go back ultimately to China?
This was an analysis led by a team at Oxford, and I think it ultimately goes back to China, but it's a hard thing, I think, I'm not sure the evidence is strong on that, because it was starting to collect sequences from around that time and trying to link in the UK, collecting sequences from outbreaks across Europe and then linking those to look at where had they come from, where were those connections. So it would involve then connecting also and linking to data from China. But that's something that is a bit beyond my area of expertise.
Okay. One more thing, and then I'll let you off the hook briefly. Am I right that the cell phone data and the other data that you look at is anonymized to the extent that you cannot, you can see movements of people, but you don't know for certain which of them are carrying the virus? Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. All we're seeing is aggregated movements of smartphones, and so it's essentially, as you look at Google Maps on your smartphone and you see a road turn red, that's a whole bunch of phones slowing down because of traffic.
Yeah.
So it's a very aggregated over space and time. So there's no, in some ways, it's hard to even identify which city or where within a city. Certainly no way to identify who those people are, but it gives pretty valuable information on the flows between sub-regions in countries, the change in those flows over time.
Right.
And that can be valuable in filling in some of the gaps and complementing the kind of analyses that are done by the genetics, where you're actually looking at which two genetic sequences are very similar and therefore likely to be a movement of a pathogen from one location to another.
That's really interesting. Well, thank you. Let me come to Jennifer Morris of the Travel Trade Gazette. Jennifer, as I say, I took a screenshot of your homepage this morning. Updated, Hayes Travel to close 88 ex-Thomas Cook stores. Government suspends all travel corridors with the UK. A London agency not named ceases trading. UK likely to be the first to restart leisure travel, says TUI. And adventure specialist Toucan Travel ceases trading. We also know, thanks to my colleague Phoebe, that an outbreak in a quarantine hotel this morning has led to a total lockdown again in the state of Victoria and empty arenas at the Australian Open. I've got two questions, one about punters and one about the industry. Can you tell from where you sit how punters generally are reacting to the new rules in terms of making plans or cancelling plans? Can you gauge the national mood on that?
Yeah, so I think pre-Christmas, like with lots of sort of aspects of this pandemic, there was a lot more optimism in the industry. Things were looking like they were getting back on track. We saw a huge uptake in bookings for this summer. And as we all know, that's sort of quickly unraveled with the new variants and everything like that. So in the last few weeks, we've definitely seen, a rise in cancellations and rebookings. However, what I would say is, and we've always found this throughout.
Rising cancellations and rebookings, so people are essentially trying to push them back, are they?
Yeah, push them back further. So, and some of these people will have obviously already sort of rebooked for this year from last year, and they're kind of rolling them on because, as you'll know, a lot of travel companies have adopted much more flexible booking and rebooking policies. So while it's obviously caused a lot of uncertainty, especially the announcement of the quarantine hotels, because obviously people can't afford to suddenly be faced with a huge bill if they do want to travel, which obviously, as we would all agree, is probably not a sensible time to travel anyway. It's indeed illegal to travel at the moment. The consumer confidence issue is a big one, because what the industry would argue is that whilst we completely, are not at odds with the kind of public health need to shut borders at the moment, that's pretty much, commonly agreed stance. It's just the fact that we feel like the government could work harder to come up with a bit of a strategy for the industry that we accept might change, but just so that we can have a bit more of an idea of when travel might be possible. Because, this is a huge industry, third largest industry in the country. 164,000 jobs have already been made redundant or at risk of redundancy. This is a huge part of the economy that we need to consider, hand in hand with the health aspect. I completely appreciate that health has to be the main priority, but if customers can't see a kind of window where it's likely that they'll be able to travel without, facing huge obstacles, it's just going to cause more and more financial collapses, more and more impact on the industry. But what we've always found throughout numerous different crises is that consumers, as you hinted at the beginning, Giles, are really keen to book their holidays. I should say that we specialise in leisure travel. We do a little bit of business travel as well, but on the whole, we represent travel agents and tour operators, the sort of SMEs in the industry. And consumers don't like foregoing their holiday. Obviously, this is a very different set of circumstances where you're carrying a risk if you travel, and to others as well. But it's seen as a priority these days in the Western world, at least, not a kind of novelty as it was perhaps 10, 20 years ago. And I think people, are just so desperate, having cancelled or not had their holidays last year, to be able to have something to look forward to when it is safe to do so. And that's the important point. I think sometimes the industry is seen as kind of ignoring the public health need here, and that's not the case. It's just this kind of requirement for a bit more clarity from the government, and I'll probably come on to this later, but also some tailored support from the government for such a huge industry that they seem to not be acknowledging has been essentially decimated for the last year and pretty much closed down.
In a second, I'd like to come to Siobhan Smith if she's willing to tell us a bit more about your caravan park and the bookings that you've received and how you handle them and how you're planning ahead. Siobhan's mentioning her caravan park in the chat, but Jennifer, can I just take you back to last year? And I appreciate that you speak mainly for SMEs, smaller travel agents, rather than the bigger players in the industry. But is it reasonable to argue? We had the CEO of Virgin Atlantic on for a session a while back, and he gave us a sort of a TikTok of their kind of high-level negotiations with the government over protocols at airports. And clearly, if you're Virgin Atlantic, you want to be back in business, back in the sky as soon as possible. Has there been lobbying from the travel industry generally that might have delayed the kind of tougher rules that we're only now seeing?
I personally don't think that's the case. I think, if anything, speaking directly to to airlines and other travel companies that all make up this huge sector, if anything, I think they feel like they've still not really been heard and not really been recognised, and perhaps aren't getting their message through to government. I don't think that's the case. From my perspective, I think the government simply hasn't prioritised travel as an industry to kind of take into account particularly. Obviously, we saw the kind of Eat Out to Help Out scheme last year for domestic sort of hospitality and catering businesses, which is fair enough. But there's been no equivalent for travel, which I understand has its kind of unique kind of problems and limitations. Obviously, you're talking about people moving around. But no, I wouldn't say that. I think the government just generally doesn't seem to understand the industry, despite it being, a kind of year of lobbying, not necessarily for the opening up of borders, but for more information, for sector-specific support and that kind of thing. We're still waiting really for any kind of direct sort of acknowledgement from government ministers. This week alone, we've seen 3 different government ministers, including the Prime Minister, say different things about when summer holidays will be possible, which just shows this huge disconnect, really. I think another issue that travel faces is that it's comprised of so many different government departments. You've got the Foreign Office, you've got the Department for Transport, you've got the Home Office, obviously in terms of inbound, and there just seems to be this huge lack of communication between them. So I think if there's been any delay, it's kind of just directly from the government having its priorities elsewhere, really, rather than travel getting in the way of borders being locked down, being closed. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm realizing that we haven't quite got to the heart of the question of if it's smart now, would it have been smart much earlier? And Andy, I hope we can come back to that. But first, can we come to Siobhan?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Siobhan. So tell us about your, this is the coal face, as it were. I'm sure it's much more pretty and idyllic than that. But about running the caravan park, are you basically still in business, or are you just clinging on? And how do you manage these sort of fluctuating bookings?
We're probably a slightly niche example. We're a static caravan park, so a lot of owner-occupied units and static caravans. We've got about 200, but we've also got a small touring park, so we take about 45 on there. They're incredibly regular customers. They've been coming for a long time, a lot of them. It's just been interesting. We're shut for the winter. Obviously, the opening date is supposed to be the 27th of March, but we can't predict whether or not we're going to open or not. Business-wise, we've been okay because it's a long-established family business. They had enough cash in the bank to kind of ride through last year. We passed on a lot of our discounts to our customers to make up for the fact they couldn't get down during the season. So we opened on the 4th of July in the end. We had to cancel.
Surely you had costs rather than discounts to pass on, or?
The family own the site. We do have costs. We have staff costs. We had the VAT saving that we passed on to the customers to try and sort of anticipate any complaints they would have had. They're usually able to come down in the day over the winter to check things out. They weren't able to do that. They weren't able to use their caravans or come on site for 3 months of the season, and we're only open for 7 months of the year. So,
okay. And what are you doing now as all your customers wonder whether they can come back? Are you just putting them on rolling bookings, or?
Rolling bookings, really. The same as we did last year, where we had to cancel a huge range of them, where we were refunding deposits, moving bookings. A lot of people wanted to have their money held on the system and then they can rebook later on. But obviously it was such a busy season once we'd opened, and that was with social distancing and facilities closed and everything, and it was still busy enough that we pretty much covered our costs for the touring pitch for the season. And I feel like that's the same again this year. I think the upsurge in bookings in the last couple of weeks, despite ministers saying don't book your summer holidays, people are still calling and still booking. And primarily the thing that I'm finding from their feedback, because we're very clear, saying this is going to be subject to whatever the rules are, obviously it's highly likely it might have to be cancelled, but they just want something to look forward to, and they want to take the caravan out or have a change of scene, and it's giving people something to change of scene they've planned for in the future, so that they can have a bit of respite from the lockdown, I think.
Right. No, I can completely understand that. I think we can all feel that. Can we quickly excuse the dog in the background? I knew it would happen. We'll just have to ignore it, or I'll put myself on mute while we go to Phoebe. Can we have a quick closer look at the slides that we saw at the beginning, just in case it prompts any thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Your dog had good timing for it, so it's nice and easy. Yeah, so we've kind of discussed some of this already. So this is just kind of this first slide is just a rundown of what the new rules will be from Monday. So before you travel, you must return a negative test up to 72 hours before your flight. it's always harder than it seems. I've known friends who've had real problems who making sure that it runs up to the specific time. If there's a delay on your flight, there can be lots of problems. And you also must make those quarantine arrangements. At the moment, I just checked the website again. The website is still not working. So, that will make a difference to that process. And then the other thing that a lot of people have played on is those fees. So what quarantine the designated hotel is $1,750 per person. Just to note, there is other places that use fees. Initially, Australia, there was in New South Wales, there's some discounts towards people coming into the country, but now for UK, it's per person. For example, in New Zealand, there's also family discounts, and it doesn't seem like that's the case. And if you return a positive test on either days you're tested, then you have to stay on for another 10 days. So there is a way to use your test and trace to kind of remove yourself from the quarantine. But let's say you test positive on day 8, you must continue to then quarantine. You're not going home on day 10. So it's not quite as easy as it appears. If we go to the next slide. So this is kind of looking to those border lockdowns. So this is on March 23rd. This is kind of a map that was put together by Team Oxford and compiled by Our World in Data. So as you can kind of see, we're outliers. The other places that didn't have border restrictions on the March 23rd, and this is significant, this is not those bans from China, it's significant international restrictions, were Iran, Luxembourg, Mali, Central African Republic, and Bahamas. So the interesting thing here is actually that the WHO didn't necessarily say that border restrictions were needed. Similarly, the IHR, the International Health Regulations, didn't exactly say that border controls were needed, but widely across the world, they were put in place considerable restrictions on borders. And if we go to the next slide. So did they make a difference? This is a really hard question to answer, incredibly hard question to answer. And if you look at that first wave, it's a little bit clearer. As you can see, as we get to come towards the second wave, it gets incredibly messy. But that first wave, you can see New Zealand, as we know, Australia, as we know, Singapore and Vietnam, who still have incredibly strict restrictions coming into their countries. And then up at the top, we have the UK and US. And, US did have those restrictions on China, but less so outside of China. France is kind of a weird outlier. There was some restrictions, but like us, they've had fluidity in them. Canada has had severe restrictions, but again, there's some questions around the fact that they're near the US and so it's not completely clear cut, but you clearly can see that Singapore, New Zealand, Vietnam, they're right at the bottom of that peak at the start. As we come to the second wave, it gets a bit messy. So that's when we come to the next slide. So this is some modeling. So like taking full account of the fact this is modeling. There's some margin for error. It's kind of as close as we've got. It's published in the Lancet. And I've just found it quite interesting because you're looking at May 2020 and you're looking at September 2020. And what they did is they looked at reports of modeling reports from across the world. And what they kind of found was that the impact of border restrictions in May did have a significant impact on the amount of cases, of imported cases, but less so by September. Essentially what they kind of come to the conclusion of is that at the start of the pandemic, when there was a smaller number of cases, that made a difference. In September, it's less clear cut. And that's kind of where they can see the difference there in the data. So when we're looking at those initial border closures, then they would have made a difference. And coming to them now, there's an argument there. The difference, of course, now is that past September, the new variants came in. We know now that the variants are more transmissible. We know now that we look at that red list of countries, many of them kind of sit on South America, sit in Africa, sit in places like Portugal. And we know that that's the kind of restriction on the variants. So that might be a slightly different, have slightly different impact on the data. It'll be interesting to see in a few months what that impact would be on imported cases. And then we go to the final slide. So this is talking about industry. So on Tuesday morning, we had John Holland Kay, CEO of Heathrow. Although he was very supportive of the government and of their new hotel quarantine procedures, he did make a very good point that while planes are grounded at Heathrow, the UK economy is being held back. It's an incredibly important port, and it's not just about holidays, it's about supply chains, it's about people who use it for business, it's about people seeing their families. It's an incredibly vital part of the UK infrastructure. And similarly, there was a letter put forward by chief executives of some major airlines, put forward and was published in Sky. And it was, it's incredibly interesting because they said that there's no compelling scientific evidence.
Could you try again?
Oh, apologies, that's my Siri. Producing a potential blanket of quarantine hotels is necessary in addition to measures only recently introduced. So to them, they didn't see the scientific evidence for it. And then we kind of look at it again, and finally, kind of Australia is a great example. We've seen there that there's incredibly much stricter regulations in Australia at the moment in terms of the hotels. For example, you're not allowed to smoke if you're in one of the hotels in Australia. At the moment, a security guard in the UK will be able to escort you outside. Small things like that make a difference. If you infect staff is then when it can transfer outside of the hotel. So it's not as easy as borders stop the virus, and it's not as easy as putting the borders in now, like what difference that will make. But yeah, that's kind of it.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. And I see while you were talking, there's a lively debate in the chat. Tom McCallum's in the middle of it on can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, on the merits of the Australian approach as distinct from ours. And Tom, I'd like to come to you in a second, but first, can we come back to Professor Andy Tatem? The official advice, as I recall, from SAGE and possibly the other committee whose acronym is SPIMO, in February and including into March last year, was that closing borders wasn't worth it. But one of those slides that Phoebe just showed us showed that we were not in particularly good or numerous company in deciding not to impose any serious border controls at that time. Central African Republic, Iran, they have a very different role in the global travel map than we do, much less vulnerabilities. From the data that you were looking at then, did the UK miss a moment? And especially bearing in mind Phoebe's other slide, which showed move fast and you get better results from border controls. Did we miss a moment?
Yes, I think we did. And I think many of those scientists who serve on those panels also have realized, yeah, at the time, we didn't quite know how big an outbreak was going on in mainland Europe. And it's pretty clear now from a growing amount of evidence that closing borders, putting in strong testing would have very much slowed things down. And it's hard to say. I mean, I see a great debate going on about, at the moment, there's this balance between, are we aiming for COVID zero? Are we aiming for kind of Australia, New Zealand situation? Or at the moment, the focus is on a similar thing, that the travel bans, and as long as you have the travel bans they kind of never work in terms of completely stopping viruses coming in. We've seen that all over the world with multiple diseases, but they can very much slow things down. And if you have a very good testing and tracing system in place, you can capture those that do come in and keep things at a normal life. As we've seen in the chat there are people in Australia who go to big sporting events, can hug each other, can meet up. And so that's the question of a big question at the moment. And some of the, I think, the uncertainties that Jennifer is talking about as well is what is the longer term strategy here? I can see the strategy at the moment of these variants are a real worry if we are investing a huge amount in the vaccine program and we're letting in variants that could be resistant to those vaccines, and we have to quickly add a booster jab to all those millions of people, and that investment has gone. So I can see that, but there's also a longer term strategy in question here to be truly open again. If we vaccinated everyone, we need to vaccinate the whole world. these variants will continue to arise. There are thousands of them out there. There's thousands of variants been detected. Some are just, this is a natural thing that always happens with viruses. So it's we have to think about the longer term strategy as well.
Sure. Okay. Well, maybe we'll get to that before the hour's over. But I did want to come to Tom, if we can. Tom McCallum, what's your position on the debate between the UK hodgepodge and the Australian approach?
My general position is the UK hasn't been leading on anything, and they've been too insular and inward focused. So, you know, how do we pay the hotels for the quarantines, etc., a year after the rest of the world got going with this? Mm-hmm. So if I make a parallel, which is actually a bit closer to home, which is the UK currently has 3 geographies that are UK territories that are COVID zero: the Isle of Man, Guernsey, and the Cayman Islands. And I'm a Caymanian, right? So my 3 kids have been living an absolutely normal life since last June, but they were in 24/7 curfew at times, where if you walked outside the door, the police would pick you up and throw you in jail and give you a $10,000 fine. And the Cayman dollar is about the same as a pound. All right? They actually handed over constitutionally control of the country to the police commissioner with a full agreement. So much like Jacinda Ardern talks about a team of 5 million, right? Their tourism industry, which I've been part of for 30 years, is decimated by this. And what they're doing is they're paying people 1,500 Cayman dollars a month while they're out unemployed. And they're all on the same team. The bit that the minister skirted, and I gave James a bit of a hard time for allowing him off the hook, is the government currently is running a party line that they won't accept vaccine passports or do anything about it. But I think Jennifer, being part of TIG, would know that IATA is already leading on this. And there are vaccine passports, and Emirates are using them and others are using them. We will have vaccine passports. So to what Andy was saying, we're going to have border controls. And yes, the UK is rolling out the vaccine. So until the world gets vaccinated, and we have a lot of vaccine nationalism going on, we're going to have border controls. And and we'll need vaccine passports. And a last thought is that well under 1% of the global population takes international leisure travel by air. It's a real luxury. Now, we don't perceive it as such. So if you are visiting family, if you're on business, if you've got valid reasons for travel, you're going to get a vaccine passport to travel. If you fly to the US, which, by the way, you have not been able to do for nearly a year, they closed the borders to all non-residents, so it isn't a transit point right now, right, from Brazil. You've linked into APIS systems, your visa waiver or your visa for many, many years. You can't even board the plane. So there will be international aviation linked vaccine passports coming, and they will be happening. But because we can't stick a Union Jack on the software, right, the current elected government isn't leading on this story. So mark my words, within a month, you're going to hear them announce it.
Tom, while we're on that, I remember picking up the fag end of this debate about why they cannot bring themselves to basically call a vaccine certification a vaccine passport. Can you explain that in a bit more depth, or at least your take on that?
Well, James did try to give the minister, was really open, and it was very positive thinking, I felt, on Monday.
We're talking, by the way, for people who weren't there, about a conversation with Nadeem Zahawi just a few days ago.
To the vaccine deployment. And he was very open, and I think it was a really positive one, and James, as usual, led it well. But when we got onto vaccine passports, he just repeated the same line. You can get it from your GP, you can get it from your GP, you can get it from your GP. But there are currently 5 vaccine passports, electronic passports out there used by multiple global airlines, including Emirates. And they're linked in through international aviation. So it's going to happen. It's already happening. So why wouldn't they do it? My own gut feel is because it wasn't invented here.
Simple as that, eh?
Yeah, there's no factual basis for what I'm saying. It's just a gut feel.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, look, I want to come back to Andy and Jennifer shortly, but Yelena, you've got your hand up. Let's come to you.
Hi, Giles. I suppose it's the point/sneaky question that I want to try and make about this is a bit more about longer term looking at travel. And I'm really glad that we're joined today by TTG, because I think that Sophie Griffiths has actually been doing a really fantastic job, especially her appearances on BBC News, talking about the problems that SMEs are facing. And something that popped in my mind is whether we're going to see the sort of end of the traditional package holiday with this. And it's interesting because Sophie kind of argues that we won't. In fact, people are more likely to start booking with travel agents and to book these packages because they have a degree of trust and protection there that we don't see with online retail. But something else that Sophie's raised is this issue of post-COVID under-tourism, whereas in the past, when we've talked about travel and how sustainable it is, we look at over-tourism. And actually, Sophie's been pointing out that some areas might be under threat now because of this phenomena of under-tourism, and especially she's been speaking about conservation projects. And I wonder how tenable that is. Are we really going to see a phenomena of under-tourism? Is it going to be that dangerous with respect to environmental and economic sustainability in the industry?
That's a really good question. Sorry, is Sophie in the chat and I've missed her?
No, Sophie is editor of TTG.
Ah, okay. And Jennifer's with us. Let's go back to Jennifer. Is this the end of the package holiday?
Yeah, so Sophie is my editor, my direct line manager, and yeah, she's been all over the news of late, talking about the sort of the woes of the travel industry. Yeah, it's a really good point, and of course, I probably would be along the same line of thinking as Sophie. Interestingly, we actually had some figures from ABTA, which is the sort of UK Travel Association, at the end of last year that said people are 20% more likely to use a travel professional to book their next holiday. That's travel agents or tour operators. And Advantage Travel Partnership, which is another organisation, said that within that, the sort of millennial 25 to 34-year-old bracket was also 44% more likely to use a travel professional, which obviously traditionally hasn't been a sort of big market for travel agents. I think it's true. I think consumers have been hugely burnt. Everybody would have seen the headlines all throughout last year. This sort of struggles with getting money back, the refund problem, especially from specifically some of the airlines, some of the big online travel agencies, which some of whom have actually been sort of pursued by the Competition Markets Authority through various government departments to kind of get the money back for consumers. And I think the fact that you could, if you use a travel agent, you've kind of got that one point of contact who you can actually get in touch with if anything goes wrong, whether you're able to travel or not, even if it's a case of having to, push your holiday or whatever further down the road. It's just having that person that you can speak to. And with regards to package holidays, which is on the whole what travel agents tend to sell, those actually offer a lot more financial protection. And obviously financial protection is going to be a huge factor going forward. People are going to want to know that their money is protected. Because again, that's been a big part of what's gone wrong last year, is that there's this kind of strange network in travel where the final suppliers, the kind of hotels and the airlines have the final money, and then the travel agents and operators are sort of the middleman, and they then need to pass it on to the consumer. And so agents and operators were stuck not being able to pass on that cash because the end suppliers weren't giving it back to them quite often. So I think it's probably in everybody's interest to carry on with a model that protects the consumer at the end. I think also there's been a bit of a shift towards trust accounts. I know that Trailfinders, for example, is a company that operates its own trust accounts, kind of not depending too heavily on the Civil Aviation Authority's ATOL scheme and ABTA, but they sort of ring fence their own money so that it's kind of all under control. So I think, if anything, packages probably are going to be more appealing to people. If you book on your own different elements, you're going to be spending your year chasing that money, which is obviously not as satisfactory as a consumer.
Jennifer, on the one hand, you've got then an uptick in trust in travel agents. On the other hand, you've got travel agents hurting very badly right now for want of any targeted government support. Is that a bit of a tricky place for the people that you, in a sense, represent to be? Because the government will look at them and say, they'll be all right when vaccines kick in and holidays come roaring back. They are not at the top of our list.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to remember that the travel kind of network, if you like, it can't just be switched on and off. Everything is so sort of fragilely dependent on everybody else. Airlines have obviously slashed their route networks for the year ahead. A lot of them are under significant financial pressure. I think, you know, it's, as you say, on the one hand, we're expecting this big boom in travel bookings and people wanting to get away potentially because they haven't been able to so far. But a lot of travel companies won't survive much longer. It's been, as I say, nearly a year now of kind of closures and on and off, and also what the government seems to have failed to acknowledge is that these travel agents and operators are paying out huge amounts of refunds whilst obviously not making much fresh money at all. Also, a lot of them haven't been able to make the most of the furlough scheme because they've had to keep staff on to kind of service those bookings that need rebooking, looking after customers who are stuck. So it's a really difficult position for them, and they really are on their knees, actually, as you say. Whilst they might be wanted by the consumer, and you know, going forward it might be, you know, happy days for travel agents, it's going to be really difficult for a lot of them to survive much longer if we don't get any sort of targeted support from the government. I think there's perhaps a bit of a reluctance from the government to support outbound travel too much when obviously there's a national crisis. Perhaps their focus is more on domestic and inbound because that's, I suppose, where the dollars are for them. But as I've said before, this is an absolutely huge industry, third largest in the country. I think got a figure here about the outbound leisure and business industry is worth £37.1 billion to the UK economy. It doesn't seem to be getting much acknowledgement at all.
And the figure of 164,000 jobs, those are already lost?
Sorry, so that's jobs that have either been made redundant or are at risk of redundancy. And that figure was actually from November. So that figure will be much higher now. We know for a fact that far more jobs have been made redundant. As you mentioned, the Hayes Travel story from a few weeks ago about they've closed down 88 of the Thomas Cook shops that they'd taken on after that company collapsed. Although they have said that they're going to try and protect some of their jobs in a different way. But yeah, lots of redundancies are on the offing at the moment.
Right. So in the time that remains to us, and there's not a great deal left, I want to try and get a sense of what stability looks like, or I say stability rather than success or the end of the tunnel or whatever, because otherwise I think we'll just hex it. But Andy, if we can come back to you, as you look at all this data from academic studies, from mobile phones, are there any particular patterns or developments that you're looking for that will tell you, okay, this is at least a new status quo and we can build on this? I mean, are there any particular groups of people who you want to see staying put, or is there any trace in the genomic data which will tell you, phew, I think the variants are moving less quickly now?
Yeah, I think
that's simple, right?
It's a tricky question. I don't know. What we'd like to see, I guess, is what really should have been put in place right from the start, is getting those cases down and then putting in place a very strong test and trace system. And if we are getting those cases down so that they are manageable and we can test those and we can look at the genetics and show that those genetics are not showing community transmission or are not showing a huge number coming in from one certain location, that they are just individual introductions and they're manageable. That's I guess what the state that we're looking for. But at the moment, I think we're definitely not quite there yet. I think hence we're stuck in this kind of, I guess, halfway system, as we have been along a lot of the way. As Tom mentioned, some countries have really taken this seriously and locked down everything and been able to carry on as normal within their own borders, and look out to see that others are trying to get this balance between economics and health, when actually it's almost like a false balance. It's not one or the other.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. So I appreciate that even with the most enlightened, far-sighted government, we might end up at a different place on that balance than Australia. But what do you make of the argument that the UK is fundamentally different from Australia and New Zealand because it's at the nexus of a global travel network and is so dependent on that for its economic well-being, that we could never have shut down in the way they did.
Yeah, it's certainly, we're in a situation geographically and demographically that is much harder to deal with than New Zealand, Australia, Cayman Islands. It's we are very high density, very well connected internally and very well connected externally. We do have the advantage of an island when we're not in the same situation as France or Germany, which really do have to think about much stronger coordination. But we do have a control over our borders in a way that many other countries don't, because we don't have a land border.
Okay. I've got one more question for you and Jennifer. Excuse me while I just deal with that. We've all got to learn to control our mobiles. Stuart, I'm so sorry, you've had your hand up, and as you say, it keeps disappearing. Can we come to Stuart? There we go. We're a bit short of time, but please say what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll make it brief then. Hi, Giles and experts and other talks members. Just want to say, if at the beginning of the whole pandemic, when we knew that it was coming out of it, obviously we didn't start spreading it, and it came from abroad. So if they closed the borders back when they knew it was spreading around the world, we wouldn't even have the virus in this country. So it was imported. So I think the airlines are largely to blame. I think they probably pressured the government into staying flying because they were scared of losing income. But guess what? People's health had to come first at the beginning to prevent it. And obviously now they're starting to realise that.
You also made the point in the chat, Stuart, that they weren't even taking people's temperatures in airports until May last year, and perhaps even later.
I think taking people's temperature is key, because obviously, you know, a lot of the other symptoms, if people only get mild symptoms of COVID, then, you know, it's hard to tell whether it's just normal flu. Wonder how many people are actually getting COVID and thinking, oh, it's just flu, and taking limb zips and stuff and going out and spreading it. And obviously, unwittingly.
Yeah.
You know,
point well taken. Thank you, Stuart. Before we've completely run out, I want to come first back to Andy and then Jennifer. My question, I rightly or wrongly suggested in the Tortoise Sensemaker email this morning, I created the concept of peak isolation. Are we there now, or is it still to come? Andy?
Peak isolation. I think we're getting there. It could certainly get stronger if it looks like what's being put in place is, from the surveillance data, is still bringing in worrying types of variants. That's for sure. But I think, yeah, it's really hard to say, but looking at those countries that have succeeded in keeping COVID very low and manageable, they have put in place very stringent measures and only needed to do them for quite a short time internally, but have kept those borders pretty tightly shut. So
yeah,
if we're aiming for that kind of situation, then yeah, that may have to be the case.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, are we at peak isolation? Will we look back on February 2021 as the nadir of this from a movement perspective?
Potentially, and I think what the industry has always thought, that if there are stricter measures in place now, maybe it's the optimist in me, but if we have stricter measures in place now, you know, basically the faster we can get back to a normal way of living, the better. So the industry on the whole would support measures that mean that long term we can get back to sort of selling holidays. At the moment, it's not really a peak time for leisure travel anyway. People aren't obviously going on their summer holidays right now. But what we would like to say is that the department, the DFT, I think, has been circulating communication saying it is illegal to go on holiday, it's illegal to go on holiday, which is absolutely true, but it's not illegal to book a holiday. And if people want to kind of help retain an industry that's really on its knees, then, you know, book your holiday. If you can afford it, book your holiday now. And, you know, everything's so much more flexible now. You should be able to, you know, look after your money pretty well, and eventually get away further down the line.
That's a really good distinction. It's not illegal to book. Thank you very much, Jennifer, Andy, everyone who's taken part. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everyone to talk, but the chat has been very busy. I've underlined in red Andy noting that, yes, we missed a moment last year. I thought you, Andy, were going to be easier on the government, actually, but that's a pretty firm verdict. And I would be fascinated to see your nerve center. I know it's not like that. I know it's probably a laptop, but I can imagine a whole room full of mission control type screens. All the data comes in and tells us when we can go back to normal, or the new normal. That distinction, Jennifer, that you just made between going and booking is so important, because as somebody else mentioned earlier on, and I forget exactly who it was, forgive me, it is the anticipation of a holiday that is such a big part of the value that you get from arranging it. And that is the dilemma on whose horns we all find ourselves now. And yeah, the industry is clearly being flexible. If you're careful, you won't lose your money. So if you have any spare and want to feel a bit better, then why not go ahead and book something? My parents have booked a walking holiday in Northumbria. God, I hope the sun comes out. Anyway, thank you very much. It's 5 past already. I don't think we've got any TV watching recommendations. People were far too deeply involved in the actual subject at hand, which is a good thing. Thanks very much for joining us. Join us again next Friday at 1 o'clock for the next Sensemaker Live. Bye then.